All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with Power Clean Future Ohio's webinar on energy efficiency conservation block grants. So I'll start just a quick intro. My name is Joe Flaherty. I'm the Executive Director of Power Clean Future Ohio. All of you all joining us here today as PCFO communities, we're really excited to have you. We provide technical assistance and support to communities that join PCFO to help them pursue federal grants. Number one, what we're talking about today, pursue federal funding, help implement that federal funding. But really, we started with the sole focus around how do we help communities embrace clean energy, do sustainability and climate action planning, build out sustainable transportation solutions, all the very important things it takes to reduce our emissions and also save cities money in the process. So that's a little bit on us. We have now 43 PCFO communities, which we're really excited to work all across the state with villages, counties, and cities of every shape and size. So if there's any on here that you want to connect with, you don't have the right contact information, please follow up with us and we can make sure to get that to you. So with that, today we're talking about energy efficiency conservation block grants, a really exciting, flexible spending opportunity for cities to be able to invest in the technologies that we want to see in our communities that create healthier environments and save us money and ultimately help our collective challenge of addressing climate change as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Melanie Nutter to take it from here. And again, please, as folks are joining, drop your name and your affiliation in the chat so that folks know who's here with us, and we'll have the chance to talk some more here in a second.
Great. So good afternoon, and thank you all again for the opportunity to present Power Clean Future Ohio's webinar on the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program, or as we will refer to it throughout the webinar, EECBG. We're looking forward to sharing this information on this funding opportunity and how these resources can directly help advance your clean energy and equity goals. Today's webinar is really intended to be an orientation to the Department of Energy's most recent EECBG program. We will do a few different things today. We'll review the program funding levels, eligibility, potential funding uses, information on competitive grants, how to apply for the funds, and also application requirements. As Joe mentioned, we will leave time in the presentation after each section for exchange and dialogue among the PCFO communities that are in attendance today. The content for today's webinar has been compiled from DOE's introductory EECBG webinar for local governments, the formula grant application, and other online resources. So thanks again in advance for your interest in the EECBG program and for your engagement during today's webinar. Next slide. So the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program is led by the Department of Energy's State and Community Energy Program. EECBG may be a familiar acronym to some of you. Under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, DOE received $3.2 billion for the first round of EECBG funding. This was a single allocation from the federal government, and grants were administered from 2009 to 2015. Under the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act that was just recently passed, DOE was allocated $550 million for the program and will be distributed both through formula as well as competitive grants, which we'll discuss today. While this funding level is a portion of what was allocated in 2009, these funds still represent a significant direct investment in tackling climate change mitigation in cities and counties throughout the US. The EECBG program is designed to provide, as Joe said, flexible funding for projects and programs that support these three key environmental and sustainability goals: to cut carbon emissions, to improve energy efficiency, and to reduce energy use. And since so many federal grants do require matching funds, it's important to note that there are no matching grant requirements for EECBG funds. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there are two grant types for the EECBG program: formula funds and competitive grants. Formula funds have been allocated largely based on population size of the community. For formula grants, eligible entities include local governments, cities that have more than 35,000 people or are in the 10 most populous cities in the state. Counties are with more than 200,000 people or the 10 most populous counties in the state. Tribes, as well as states and territories, are also eligible. 51 Ohio cities and counties have been allocated formula funds through this calculation. Any local governments and state recognized tribes that aren't eligible for these formula funds can apply for the second type of funding or competitive grants. Teams of eligible entities can also apply. DOE anticipates that they will be making from the national level 5 to 12 awards total for the competitive funding. And I do know on today's webinar, I think we have a mix of cities that both have formula funds as well as those who intend to apply for competitive grants. So we'll cover both. Next slide. So this is the allocation overview. The $550 million of EECBG funds that are allocated break down in the following way. So 431.2 million, or 98% of the funds, are formula grants. More specifically, 1,878 local governments across the country will be receiving $299.2 million. 56 states and territories will be receiving 123.2 million. One important note is that states must pass through 60% of their funds to ineligible local governments. So these will be competitive grants that will be organized by the state of Ohio. We'll talk a little bit more about that. 774 Indian tribes will be receiving $8.8 million. $8.8 million, or 2% of the funds, are left for competitive grants. So we'll go into this opportunity, but there are really two pathways for communities that are not getting formula funds to apply for EECBG funds. Next slide. So to go into that a little bit more specifically, for communities on the call today who do not have access to the formula funds and are planning to pursue competitive grants, there are two pathways. The first way is to apply for competitive funds to the state program. As I mentioned, Ohio and all states are required to pass through 60% of their formula funding to local governments. Ohio will be receiving $3.1 million. States are required to apply by July 31st and will be prioritized for application review in order to expedite subgrants. The other thing to mention is that states need to distribute subgrants within 180 days of submitting their energy efficiency and conservation strategy, which we will talk about in a little bit. Taking these two deadlines into account, we anticipate that the window for subgrant applications to the state will likely be next year. We think likely summer or fall of 2024. So you have some time to plan. The second pathway to pursue for competitive grant funds is at the national level through DOE's competitive program. DOE is still designing its competitive program, so at the moment, there's still limited information on application requirements. Some of you may know that there was an RFI that was recently released earlier this year where they requested feedback on program design. We expect that once this feedback is both reviewed and incorporated, DOE will release more details on this competitive program. Just a couple of other things to mention about the competitive funds. We do anticipate that the project scope will be similar and that the program will be highly competitive. And while there are two pathways for PCFO communities to apply for EECBG program funds, either through the state or through DOE, the state pathway is likely to be more fruitful to Ohio communities, specifically PCFO communities, since Ohio has $3.1 million to allocate. Or at least 1.9 million will be available to allocate to eligible Ohio communities through subgrants. So all of that is to say, if you're applying competitively to EECBG, you can consider the national pathway, but again, they're only doing 5 to 12 awards nationally. So you may consider the state pathway, and both of those programs are still being designed and rolled out. Next slide. So now that we've covered what is generally required for communities pursuing competitive EECBG grants, let's review how communities that have been allocated formula funds can access these resources. So for communities that are receiving formula funds, you'll either choose grants or vouchers as the mechanism to receive your funding. So for grants, to access your EECBG funds through a grant, your community should plan to submit the program formula application. This application will allow your community to receive your formula funds as a grant to utilize on eligible activities across 14 categories. If you're preparing a formula fund grant application, your community can also propose what is called a blueprint project to simplify the project selection process and expedite review. We will be reviewing these 14 product categories shortly, as well as what is entailed with a blueprint project later in the presentation. So that's one pathway. The second pathway is a system that DOE is calling vouchers. So this is the other option for applying for your formula funds. You want to consider using the voucher system instead of grants if you want to fund a suite of technical assistance services, or you want to fund equipment purchase and installation rebates, things like HVAC systems, heat pumps, window insulation, electric vehicles, or EV chargers. So as a formula fund community, you have until April 28th, 2023, or about 8 weeks to decide, since you will need to indicate whether you're choosing grants or vouchers in the pre-award information sheet. So keep that date in mind. April 28th is a key date for formula funding for EECBG funds. Next slide. So just to dive into this a little bit deeper, why would your community choose to apply for EECBG through a voucher instead of a grant? Vouchers really are designed for communities with limited staff resources and or which have relatively smaller funding award amounts. The voucher system has a lighter administrative and reporting burden. DOE recommends also that local governments who are receiving less than $250,000 in formula funds consider the grant process. And again, just to highlight a few other elements of vouchers, it's a simplified application process. There are fewer startup steps. There's a faster turnaround time to process your application. There's less of an administrative burden, and you can access direct support from technical experts and a streamlined path for equipment purchases provided by DOE. So we've listed a few examples of the types of activities you can get funded through vouchers for technical assistance and equipment rebates, which I mentioned. Overall, vouchers are a great option for communities with limited administrative capacity or lack of experience navigating a federal grant award. Next slide. So this beautiful decision tree that Katie created, thank you, is something that you can go over yourself with your team to think through which pathway you want to go. We won't go through this in detail now, but it's something that we hope that you'll access later to decide whether you want to go the grant route or the voucher route, and poses some key questions. Next slide. So out of the 51 Ohio communities receiving EECBG formula funds, 20 are PCFO communities and are listed here. To confirm your formula fund allocation, we've included a link in this presentation. We will also be putting it in the chat. It's already there if you want to take a look. Next slide. So here we wanted to take our first break and pause to pose a couple of questions to the group. Do you know the amount of your formula allocation? And if you have any questions about that, please check out the link in the chat or ask your question. And then the other question is, if you have received funds in the previous round between 2009 and 2015, what did you use those funds for, and what were any lessons learned? So we will. So now we'll dive into the formula grant program in more detail, looking at eligible activities for those who are choosing grants over vouchers. So next slide. So we've broken up the 14 different topics into types of potential uses for your EECBG funds. The first type of uses allowed under the EECBG formula funds is what we're calling foundational programs and services. So these include strategy development, the development and implementation of an energy efficiency and conservation strategy. This, by the way, can include the development of your energy efficiency and conservation strategy for the application for EECBG funds, which is required for all entities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. You can also use these funds for technical consultant services, so contracting technical consultants to develop strategies for energy efficiency and conservation programs. And then a third foundational use is financial incentive programs, which were mentioned, incentive programs for energy efficiency improvements. Next slide. The second type is what we're calling building and energy efficiency uses. So these can include things like building energy audits, so conducting residential and commercial building energy audits, energy efficiency retrofits, providing grants to nonprofit organizations and government agencies to perform energy efficiency retrofits on their properties, energy efficiency and conservation programs for buildings and facilities. This may include program design and operation, public education, measurement and verification, and identification of technologies. And then the third or fourth component here is building codes and inspections, development and implementation of building codes and inspection services for energy efficiency. So a lot really can be done to gather the data that you need for your buildings or other buildings in the community about energy use, as well as what are some of those programs and incentivizing some of the energy efficiency work. Next slide. So the third type of use allowed under EECBG funds is for transportation programs. So these include development and implementation of transportation programs, programs to conserve transportation energy, such as zoning guidelines, pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, and traffic signal upgrades. This is also highlighted in the second bullet point, traffic signals and street lighting, where you can replace with energy efficiency lighting technologies. Your non-LEDs can be replaced. And then the third is energy efficiency, renewable energy, and zero emission transportation measures. So programs for things like financing, capital investments, projects and programs that all fall into that category as well. Next slide. And then lastly, this is a miscellaneous types that we've put on this final slide for how you might be able to use your EECBG funds. The first is renewable energy tech on government buildings, implementation of on-site renewable energy at any government building, energy distribution tech, implementation of energy distribution technologies for energy efficiency, including district heating and cooling systems. Material conservation programs. These are activities to increase participation and efficiency rates, including source reduction, recycling, and recycled content procurement programs. And then finally, reduction and capture of methane and GHGs, purchase and implementation of technologies to reduce, capture, and use methane and GHGs. Next slide. So I went through those pretty quickly, but those are the 14 different types. And as you would imagine, they line up with a lot of the sustainability plans and strategies and goals that many of you have created to tackle sustainability and environmental work through the building sector as well as the transportation sector. So it's great to see that those are very well aligned with a lot of the plans that we know are out there in your communities for helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and advance sustainability. Just a few other funding guidelines we wanted to mention as you consider how you might use your funds. A few additional considerations are up to 10% of the funding can be used for administrative expenses, excluding the cost of meeting EECBG reporting requirements. Up to 20% of the funding can be used for the establishment of revolving loan funds. And then up to 20% of funding can be used to provide sub-grants to non-governmental organizations for activities assisting in the implementation of the energy efficiency and conservation strategy of the community. So another great way to involve your CBO partners and provide them with some resources to do some of this work as well. Next slide. So let's pause here again. We wanted to take a moment to open up the dialogue among the PCFO communities that are here today to share your current considerations and project ideas with each other. Based on the eligible uses for the EECBG funds, has your community decided on what type or types of projects or programs that you may fund locally with these resources? If yes, we would love to hear about your plans, anything that has been decided or seems like low-hanging fruit that you would absolutely pursue. And if not, please feel free to share some of your questions or initial considerations with the group today for feedback. We will now pause the recordings for this discussion before we continue. The Department of Energy has created a new concept called blueprint projects. Blueprint projects are step-by-step roadmaps of high impact and evidence-based clean energy projects and programs for formula grants. Local governments can use blueprints to design projects for the grant option. You do not need to use them in order to apply for the grant option. However, there are a few key benefits of blueprints that make the grant process easier, namely a streamlined application review and approval. The approval time is faster than non-blueprint grant applications, but longer than vouchers. You can quickly identify high impact projects and programs that have been pre-vetted by DOE, and you can also directly advance Justice 40 goals. There are 6 blueprint topic areas where DOE has created these plans. They include energy planning, there's 1 blueprint, energy efficiency, there are 4 blueprints, renewable energy, there's 4 blueprints, transportation, there are 2, and sustainable financing solutions for energy projects and programs, 1 blueprint. Next slide. I'm sorry, workforce development also has 1 blueprint. Next slide. So here is just one example of the blueprint for building efficiency and electrification. Essentially what this is a pre-vetted, pre-designed step-by-step process that DOE has approved and that a community can implement. In this case, they have identified 5 key steps for the projects. For this project, local governments can build a grant proposal around these steps, tailoring them with details unique to each community demographics and partners. These 5 steps specifically are develop an energy retrofit goal and strategies, bulk procurement of building energy efficiency and electrification equipment, procurement, legal and technical support and assistance, communications and website design, and program education, outreach, and advertising. So again, this is one example of the about dozen that DOE has created. Next slide. So just thinking about big picture and taking a step back, there's a few different considerations regarding how you may want to use your EECBG funds locally. And this really does come from Department of Energy, where they would like to see these funds invested in this way. The first is as a seed investment. So although there are no matching grant requirements to receive these funds, DOE sees this as an opportunity to leverage outside funding to develop mature, sustainable programs for your environmental work. This is here a recommended arc of accelerating investment that communities could follow, starting with using EECBG funds to provide seed funds to develop clean energy strategies and build local capacity. Governments then design clean energy plans and implement projects and programs. Governments would then leverage EECBG funds to secure additional funds from other state and federal programs, philanthropy, or the private sector. And then finally, EECBG could be used to catalyze self-sustaining programs that benefit disadvantaged communities. So this is sort of an ideal arc for how to really stretch and leverage your EECBG funds. Next slide. The second big picture way to invest your EECBG funds is to advance energy and equity justice. EECBG can also be an opportunity for this in your community. If this is something that you want to focus your funding on, these are just a few initial steps to get you started on your program design and elevating energy justice. The first is to identify disadvantaged communities. There are 2 primary federal tools that can be used to identify disadvantaged census tracts in your communities. Thank you, Katie, for putting those in the chat. It is the DOE Energy Justice Mapping Tool and the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. The second step would be to consider DOE's Justice 40 priorities. I know, as all of you know, that Justice 40 really is a critical component, not only for EECBG, but many federal funding opportunities that address climate mitigation and adaptation. DOE did release 8 policy priorities to advance their Justice 40 program within their programs. And again, this is a good place to start. And then a third step is to align these benefits with your project proposals, evaluating the list of eligible uses for EECBG funds to see which are best fit for you, as well as for your disadvantaged communities. Next slide. And then, as was mentioned during our discussion, there is definitely a priority for supporting teams who are applying for EECBG funds. So this is another opportunity to think about really maximize and leveraging and stretching your EECBG dollars is by teaming up. So for the EECBG formula program, all eligible entities can create teams. These teams are limited to groups of entities where all have formula allocations, which is one important component. So there's a few key considerations if you do want to join a team. Each entity must submit its own energy efficiency and conservation strategy, or EECS, again, which we will talk about shortly. Each team must choose whether they are pursuing vouchers or grants and must be aligned on that. Each team must submit a single joint application with one entity designated as the prime applicant, and then each entity is responsible for accounting, tracking, and reporting their funds. A few example teaming activities could include a regional clean energy infrastructure strategy, an energy efficiency workforce training program that is regional, and a low interest regional financing program for low income qualified residential retrofits. So if you are interested in developing a team, the end of this presentation, we will have another discussion, and that could be a good opportunity to see who else might want to join a team on a particular topic. Next slide. So we've pulled together some other key considerations that can help you decide on your project scope. A few key questions for how to decide on your projects. What projects can be achieved with your allocation? What community challenges can be addressed? And are there local stakeholders that align with potential programs? I will just mention that if you want to look at other successful program examples, the U.S. Conference of Mayors did publish a survey of how cities utilize funding in the previous round of EECBG funding. You can also choose between multiple uses, potential criteria to prioritize projects, EECBG mitigation potential, local partners, and sources of matching funds from state or philanthropic partners. Next slide. So in the last about 10-15 minutes that we have, we will go through the application process, and then we will leave some time at the end for questions and discussion. So next slide. So the application timeline. So the most important deadline coming up is, again, on April 28th, 2023, which is in about 8 weeks. All communities need to submit their pre-award information sheet to access their formula funding. And again, this is for formula funding communities, not competitive grants. In the chart, you can see that there are 4 application periods. There are windows in which you could submit your application that account for the time that DOE needs to review and administer the awards. Overall, local governments will have until January 31st, 2024, next year, to submit their full applications. However, if you are hoping to receive your award sooner, you can submit an application that aligns with one or more of DOE's priority categories to expedite review. You can use a blueprint process, which is one way to expedite it. You can join or form a team. You can focus on activities that benefit disadvantaged communities, and you can focus on activities that are limited to strategy development, technical consultant services, analysis, and stakeholder engagement. So finally, if your application is covered by one of those priority categories, you can submit in application periods 1 or 2. Otherwise, you may submit in application periods 3 or 4. Next slide. Here is more information on the award timeline for each funding type. A few key things to note in this chart. Vouchers have the fastest turnaround between application submission and award. Vouchers have the fewest application requirements. The requirements increase for grants following blueprints, and the most requirements are for grants that do not follow a blueprint project. Grants following blueprints allow you to submit a grant application in period 1 or 2. Next slide. If you haven't done so already, you will need to register with a few different systems in order to receive the award. We did cover this in our Federal Grants 101 webinar, so I'm not going to go in great detail about this, but we'll just summarize, and we'll put the link in the chat to the Federal Grants webinar 101. But the registration services that you do need to apply for are first SAM.gov, which is an official government website. This is the government-wide registry, both for vendors that work with the federal government and for federal grant recipients. Next is FedConnect, which is a privately operated repository for federal grant opportunities and awards. Through SAM and FedConnect, although they do seem duplicitous, FedConnect registration to receive award documents for some grant programs, including EECBG, is required. The third is the page portal, which is where you will submit your application and key documents. Within 3 weeks of emailing your pre-information award sheet by April 28th of this year, you can expect an email from the page system inviting you to apply for the full application. And then the DUNS number and your employer identification numbers are required for both prime and sub-grantees. And again, we will include the link to the previous PCFO Grants 101 webinar recording, where you can get more detail on registration for these key grant websites. And there it is in the chat. Thank you, Katie. Next slide. So application materials. Application materials fall into 4 main categories. You've got the pre-award information sheet. The image on the right is a screenshot of that sheet due by April 28th. You've got the application and budget files. Then the energy efficiency and conservation strategy and activity file. And again, all recipients are required to submit an individual EECS, and then compliance and assurances. We will go into more detail on the EECS, but please make sure that you've reviewed all of the application requirements on the EECBG Formula Grant Application Hub, which again is linked in the chat. Thank you to Katie. Next slide. So this is an important topic, the energy efficiency and conservation strategy, which we've mentioned throughout this presentation. Local governments are required to submit a proposed EECS that includes a description of your goals for increased energy efficiency and conservation, and a plan for the use of the grant in achieving these goals. And again, local governments must submit this either when you apply on April 28th for your pre-award, or no later than 1 year after the award date. If you choose to submit later, you must select activity 1 on the EECBG program activity file. So the good news is that DOE has created a template for local governments to craft the EECS for submission. The link is included in the chat. PCFO communities have a leg up in filling out this strategy. The template first asks about greenhouse gas emissions and other goals that you may have already set for your community through joining PCFO, and also asks for any sustainability plans or documents that you may have created or adopted or have underway. So those are great that PCFO communities do have at least the first couple of pages underway through the work that you've been doing through being part of PCFO. Many of the rest of the components of the template inquire about how your community will use these funds to further your community's sustainability goals. So if you are still beginning your community's planning process, you can use EECBG funds to develop your EECS. And frankly, we do recommend that if you are brand new to the planning process for sustainability, it might be a good pathway for you to consider using some of those funds, again, for developing the EECS and advancing your sustainability planning at the local level. Next slide. So here are, again, a summary of some of your next steps. Most importantly is to submit your pre-award information sheet by April 28th of this year in 8 weeks. Again, this is required for all entities that plan on accessing their formula funds. One important note is that though you do need to indicate whether you plan on choosing grants or vouchers, it is non-binding. So if you don't feel like you have all of your key internal stakeholders on board with your pathway, or you're still considering it, choose one of those, put it as part of your pre-information award sheet, and then you can decide later if you take a different path. The second process is to get PCFO support. So we are here to help your team work through key decisions on vouchers, blueprints, and grants, deciding on which pathway to go. We also will support energy efficiency and conservation strategy development, so please call upon us for that. And again, if you haven't watched it, we recommend watching the Grants 101 webinar that goes into detail about some of the other kind of foundational work that you need to do to access the funds. And then we've listed a few resources here for you to stay up on the latest and greatest on EECBG. So signing up for the newsletter that is put out by DOE, emailing DOE with any questions on formula grants at the email address on the slide, emailing the DOE about any community grants, again, at the email address that's provided, and then keeping an eye out for bi-weekly office hours that are hosted by DOE, and more information will be forthcoming on that. So next slide. So thank you once again for attending today's webinar and for your active participation in our discussion. PCFO is looking forward to continuing to support your community's efforts in seeking EECBG funds to advance your clean energy and equity goals. We'd now like to open it up for our final discussion as well as Q&A. Thanks again.